He kicked his daughter out for marrying a poor cowboy, but years later he found himself at his doorstep when there was no one else to turn to. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The town of Red Bluff woke each day to the same familiar symphony of sounds and smells that had marked it for decades. At dawn, the faint chime of the church bell drifted through the cool air, mingling with the sharp scent of dust and horse sweat from the main street. Wagons rattled along wooden planks laid unevenly across the ground, their iron-rimmed wheels clattering in rhythm as merchants opened their shops. The saloon's swinging doors groaned as the barkeep stepped out to sweep away last night's cigarette stubs and sawdust. Somewhere down the street, a player in a threadbare vest coaxed a hesitant melody from a piano that had seen better days, its notes tumbling into the morning like old secrets. Beyond the town, where the horizon stretched in long waves of golden grass and dry sagebrush, lay the vast pastures and herds of cattle that had built the wealth of men like Thomas Hargraves. His land extended as far as a man could ride in a day, dotted with weathered barns, grazing longhorns, and the occasional glint of a river snaking through the dust. The Hargraves ranch house was no less impressive, a sprawling two-story structure painted white, with tall columns on the front porch and wide verandas that caught every breeze. From that high perch, Thomas could see the whole sweep of his holdings and know that each fence post, each head of cattle, each hired man owed its place in the world to his ambition. Thomas Hargraves was a man molded by the frontier, hard-eyed, calculating, and unwilling to bend to anything that did not suit him. His wife, Margaret, carried herself with the same air of command, though her authority was tempered by a softer, social grace. She was the queen of her household, her days filled with managing the servants, keeping up appearances, and ensuring that the Hargraves' name was spoken with respect at every gathering in Red Bluff. Together, they were a pillar of wealth and influence, and they had only one child to carry that legacy forward. Evelyn Hargraves had returned to Red Bluff just a few months earlier, fresh from finishing school in a distant city. She had been taught to dance at formal balls, to speak with refinement, and to manage the affairs of a household with the precision of an army quartermaster. But her education had not dulled her spirit. She carried a keen curiosity about the world and an independence that quietly unsettled her parents. She had grown up knowing the worth of her father's name and the comfort it provided. Yet something in her always tugged toward the edges of that comfort, toward the dust and the wind and the quiet of the open range. It was on a day like many others that her path first truly crossed with Luke Caldwell's. There had been a commotion in the marketplace. A bay mare tethered too loosely to a hitching post had spooked at the crack of a dropped crate, jerking free and barreling through the narrow street. People shouted and scrambled to get out of the way, but the horse's wild eyes were fixed on nothing, its nostrils flaring in panic. Evelyn, standing near a stall of woven blankets, felt the air stir as the animal bore down on a small boy who had frozen in the middle of the street. Before she could move, a man broke from the crowd, his boots pounding against the boards. With a sure hand, he caught the trailing reins and turned the mare sharply aside, his voice low and steady until the animal stilled beneath him. He handed the reins back to their owner with a nod, then crouched to speak to the boy, making certain he was unhurt before rising again. That was Evelyn's first close look at Luke Caldwell, a tall, lean figure with sun-browned skin, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a calmness in his manner that seemed unshakable. Luke's life was a world apart from hers. Orphaned young, he had drifted from one ranch to another, working where he could, sleeping where the work took him. Over the years, he had managed to scrape together enough money to buy a small piece of land on the outskirts of Red Bluff, a patch of grassland bordered by a slow creek, just enough to keep a pair of horses and a handful of cows. His house was a single-room structure with a tin roof and a potbelly stove, its walls lined with the tools of a cowboy's trade. Coiled ropes, worn saddles, and a rifle propped in the corner. His neighbors knew him as a man of few words but steady hands, someone who would ride out in the middle of the night to help a rancher round up strays without asking for pay. He wasn't wealthy, and he didn't aspire to be in the way men like Hargraves did. What Luke valued was the independence of living by his own work and the honesty that came from earning every coin in his pocket. Evelyn found reasons to speak to him again after that day in the marketplace. Sometimes it was a polite exchange at the general store when he was picking up nails or feed. Other times she would see him at the edge of town, driving a few cows ahead of him, and she would stop to say hello. Their conversations were never long, but they left her feeling lighter, more awake. Luke spoke plainly, without flattery or pretense, and he listened as though her words mattered. Over the weeks, those brief moments began to stitch themselves into something more. He invited her to ride with him once, offering the steady gelding he usually kept for newcomers, and she accepted. They rode out past the town, where the land rolled away toward the horizon, and the air was full of the scent of dry grass. They spoke about small things at first, the weather, the stubbornness of mules, the price of flour in the store, but beneath it was a quiet understanding, a shared sense that they saw the world in a similar way. When Evelyn told her parents she intended to marry Luke Caldwell, the reaction was swift and fierce. Her father's voice rose like a whip crack, his eyes narrowing as if she had just told him she meant to live in the gutter. Margaret's face was pale with dismay, her words measured but no less firm. This was not a match befitting the Hargraves name. Thomas made it clear that if she went through with it, she would do so without his blessing, without a penny from his estate, and without the right to call his house her home. The arguments stretched late into the night, the same points traded back and forth until Evelyn could hardly bear to hear them. She tried to make them see what she saw in Luke, the steadiness, the honor, the quiet strength, but to her parents these were worthless without land, cattle, and the means to keep a wife in comfort. In the end, faced with a choice between the life she had always known and the man she loved, Evelyn packed her belongings into a carpet bag and walked out under the pale light of morning. Luke met her at the edge of town, where his horse was tied and his hat was pulled low against the sun. He didn't ask her to turn back, and she didn't hesitate when he reached for her bag. Together they rode to his small house, the town shrinking behind them until it was just a smudge against the endless sky. Life with Luke was nothing like the Hargraves estate. The bed was narrow, the floorboards creaked, and every meal was the result of someone's labor, his or hers. They rose before the sun to tend to the animals, mended fences when storms tore them down, and made do with what they had. Yet for all its rough edges, the days were theirs alone, unshaped by the demands of wealth or reputation. Still, the town had a long memory, and tongues wagged in the saloon, in the mercantile. Women whispered as Evelyn passed, their eyes lingering on the plain dress she wore now instead of silk. Men smirked when Luke came in to buy supplies, making comments loud enough for him to hear, but neither of them let it drive them apart. They had chosen this life, and for the moment, that choice was enough. What they did not know was that shadows were already lengthening over their days together, and the wind that whistled through the grass would soon carry with it the scent of smoke and the sound of trouble on the horizon. The days on the Caldwell place settled into a rhythm that, though modest, gave Evelyn a sense of purpose. Each morning she woke to the creak of the old windmill out back turning in the dawn breeze, and the smell of coffee drifting from the stove where Luke was already moving about. The first light poured across the plain, painting the grass in shades of gold and rust, and the sound of horses shifting in the corral reached the small house as naturally as a heartbeat. Luke would already be out feeding the stock by the time she tied her hair back and stepped into her boots, and together they would work through the morning in quiet harmony, repairing a split rail, filling troughs, checking the cattle that wandered close to the property line. Yet no matter how much they poured themselves into the land and the animals, there was never quite enough to call the place secure. The pair of cows they kept gave milk and calves. The horses were sturdy and strong, but it was work just to keep the meager herd fed and healthy. Luke took whatever odd jobs he could find in town, mending a neighbor's fence, breaking in a spirited colt for a rancher a few miles east, hauling supplies for the general store when their wagon was overloaded. Every dollar he earned went into keeping the animals alive and the roof patched over their heads. Evelyn learned to stretch what little they had, sewing patches into worn shirts, baking bread from scratch when flour was affordable, and tending a small kitchen garden near the creek that ran by the house. It was during one of Luke's trips into town for supplies that Evelyn first heard the name Clayton Barlow spoken with the kind of respect that edged into fear. She had noticed him before, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that missed little, always wearing a tailored vest no matter the heat. Barlow owned one of the largest herds in the county, a sprawling operation that stretched across miles of range, and he had the men and the money to make his word law on certain streets in Red Bluff. She saw the way he looked at her once, as though assessing not just her appearance, but her value, the way one might judge a fine horse. When Luke returned that afternoon, he mentioned him casually. Barlow had been at the saloon, holding court with a few ranchers, and had made a pointed remark about pretty girls wasting themselves on men who can barely keep their boots mended. Luke's voice was steady when he told her, but she could read the set of his jaw and the slight narrowing of his eyes. Barlow was not a man to underestimate, especially once he decided something belonged to him. As summer deepened, the work grew harder. The rains that should have come in early June skirted the plains, leaving the grass dry and brittle. Feed prices in town rose with each passing week, and Luke had to weigh every purchase against the simple question of whether it would keep them going until the next job paid. There were days when Evelyn could feel the worry in the air between them, unspoken but heavy, like the dust that settled on every surface in the house. She offered to take in sewing for some of the women in town or help at the general store, but Luke hesitated. He didn't want her exposed to the whispers and sidelong glances that already followed her whenever she walked down Main Street. But whispers have a way of carrying. The more time passed, the more certain faces turned away when she greeted them, and the more she caught the smirks from men who had once been polite. It was as though their decision to live without her father's fortune was not just a curiosity, but a spectacle. And among those whispers, the name Barlow came up again and again. It was late one evening when Luke returned from town with a tension in his shoulders she had not seen before. He told her how Barlow had cornered him outside the saloon, making jokes loud enough for everyone to hear about how a man with only a couple cows ought to pick a woman who eats less. The men at the porch had laughed, and though Luke had walked away without a word, it was clear enough to everyone present that Barlow's words were a challenge. The challenge took a darker shape not long after. One hot, windless night, Evelyn woke to the faint crackle of something out of place. At first she thought it was the windmill creaking or the horses shifting restlessly, but then the acrid scent of smoke reached her. Luke was already at the door, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the dim light, she saw it, a dull orange glow near the barn. By the time they reached it, flames were climbing the wooden siding like grasping hands. Luke threw open the door, shouting to drive the terrified animals out. A horse bolted into the night. Another stumbled but made it clear of the heat. The cows bellowed in panic, one managing to push through the gate, while another fell amidst the smoke, its hide singed. They worked until their throats burned and their muscles screamed, but the barn's timbers were dry as tinder and the fire too fast. By the time the flames died to a smoldering ruin, the air was thick with ash and the ground littered with the blackened remains of what had once been their winter feed. One of the horses was gone into the night. One cow lay still, its sides no longer heaving. The rest of the stock was scattered and skittish, the fence broken in their desperate flight. When dawn came, the damage was clearer. The barn was nothing but a charred skeleton, the feed stores reduced to ash, and the smell of smoke clung to everything. Luke's face was lined with exhaustion, his hands raw from pulling at smoldering boards. They had saved some of the animals, but without shelter or enough food, the coming weeks would be a struggle. Evelyn felt the weight of it pressing on her even as she swept ash from the porch. In town, word spread quickly. Some expressed pity in low voices, others didn't bother to hide a trace of satisfaction. A few mentioned that Barlow had been seen riding near the Caldwell place not long before nightfall, though when asked directly, those same voices fell silent. Luke didn't speak Barlow's name, but Evelyn could see in his eyes the suspicion that needed no confirmation. They cut their expenses to the bone after that, selling what little they could spare. Luke took longer jobs away from the ranch, leaving before sunrise and returning after dark, his face set in lines of fatigue. Evelyn began venturing into town more often in search of work, her pride tucked away beneath the necessity of earning something, anything. but the offers that came were often laced with the same condescension or outright disrespect. The grocer's son suggesting she could make good money if she smiled more, or the livery owner hinting at a position that came with private perks she didn't care to imagine. Each evening they would sit on the porch together, the silence between them filled with the hum of insects and the distant lowing of cattle from neighboring ranches. They didn't need to speak their fears aloud. They both knew how thin the thread was that held their life together. Evelyn would glance at Luke's profile in the fading light and think of the barn as it had been before the fire, the horses calm in their stalls, the smell of hay and leather. It seemed a lifetime ago already. The wind that blew across the plains had a different taste now, dry and sharp, carrying with it the scent of unease. Trouble was still out there, watching them from just beyond the fence line, waiting for the next chance to strike, and neither of them knew just how close it was to finding them again. The weeks after the fire took on a grim sameness, each day marked by the sound of wind scraping across the open land and the creak of the weather-beaten fence that still needed mending. The air seemed to carry the smell of smoke long after the last embers had died, as if the land itself refused to forget. Luke threw himself into the work of keeping what little they had left from slipping away, though the strain was beginning to show in the stoop of his shoulders and the set of his jaw. Evelyn had started to move with a kind of quiet determination, as though she could will their fortunes to turn simply by refusing to falter. Yet neither of them could deny that the edges of their life were fraying. It was on a morning heavy with heat that Luke saddled his horse for a trip into the next county. A rancher there had offered him a few days' work, helping to round up a group of stubborn cattle that had strayed far into the hills. The pay would be small, but it was something. Evelyn handed him a canteen and a cloth-wrapped parcel of bread and jerky, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer than usual. He smiled faintly, trying to reassure her, then swung into the saddle and headed out. The ride was long, the sun climbing steadily higher until it sat heavy overhead. The job was hard hours of riding over rough terrain, whistling and calling to bring the scattered animals back to the herd. By the time the cattle were driven safely into the holding pen, the light was already beginning to thin toward late afternoon. Luke's body ached from the saddle, and his throat felt dry despite the water he had carried. He started back toward Red Bluff, the trail ahead shimmering in the distance, the land stretching away in all directions like an ocean of gold and dust. It was along a lonely stretch of that road, where the tall grass whispered against the fence posts and no sound of hoofbeats but his own could be heard, that he saw the shape. At first it looked like nothing more than a bundle of old clothes cast aside near the ditch, but something in the stillness of it caught his eye. He slowed, guiding his horse closer. As he approached, the outline resolved into that of a man lying on his side, hatless, his clothes coated in dust. Luke dismounted, the leather of his boots creaking in the quiet, and crouched beside the stranger. The man's skin was pale beneath the grime, his lips cracked, and his chest rose and fell so faintly Luke might have missed it if he hadn't been looking closely. He touched 2 fingers to the side of the man's neck and felt a weak, faltering pulse. "Sir," Luke said quietly, though he knew there would be no answer. The man's eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. The heat of the day had clearly taken its toll. This was no drunken sleep in the shade. This was the edge of something final. Luke looked up and down the road, but there was no one in sight. A pair of vultures circled far off against the blue, their dark wings cutting across the sun. Without wasting another moment, Luke slipped an arm beneath the man's shoulders and heaved him upright. The weight was more than he had expected, dead weight, unresponsive, but Luke shifted and managed to get the stranger draped across his own back. It took effort to lift him into the saddle, steadying him so he wouldn't slump too far forward or back. And then Luke mounted behind, holding him steady with one arm, as he urged the horse into a steady, urgent pace toward town. The ride was long and difficult. Twice, Luke had to slow when the man's head lolled too far to one side, and he could feel the heat of fever radiating through the worn fabric of the man's shirt. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that reached across the road, and Luke pushed the horse harder until the outskirts of town finally came into view. He headed straight for the small clinic on the north end of Red Bluff, a place with 2 rooms, a narrow porch, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Dr. Halpern, Physician." He called out before he had even reached the steps, and a nurse hurried out, her eyes widening at the sight. Within moments, they had the man off the horse and onto a stretcher, carrying him inside. Luke followed, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The air inside was cooler, shaded from the sun, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. He stood aside as the doctor checked the man over, speaking in low tones to the nurse. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Halpern came over, a small smile breaking through his otherwise professional manner. "You brought him in just in time," he said. "Another 30 minutes, and I doubt he'd have made it. Severe dehydration, heat exhaustion. He's resting now." Luke nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Glad to hear it." "You saved his life," the doctor added. "Not many would have stopped." Luke looked toward the closed door of the sick room, where he could hear the faint sound of breathing. "Couldn't just ride past," he said. "Wouldn't have sat right." He stayed for a while sitting in the plain wooden chair by the door, listening as the man's breathing grew steadier. When at last Luke left, the sun had nearly set, casting the street in a warm glow that softened even the rough edges of the saloon. He rode home with the day's dust on his clothes and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing a life had been pulled back from the brink. The next morning, Evelyn greeted him with a questioning look as he entered. Over a simple breakfast, he told her the story, how he had found the man, the ride into town, what the doctor had said. She listened intently, her hands stilling on the edge of her coffee cup, and when he finished, there was a faint light in her eyes. "You did a good thing," she murmured. 2 days later, Luke returned to the clinic. The nurse at the desk smiled when she saw him. "He's awake now," she said. "Asked about you." She led him to the small room at the back, where the man lay propped up on pillows. The color returned to his face. When the man looked at him, there was a clarity in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "You came back," he said, his voice still rough. "Didn't think you would." "Had to see how you were doing," Luke replied. The man's mouth curved into a faint smile. "Name's William Camden," he said. "Maybe you've heard it." Luke blinked, recognition dawning. Camden was known across the territory, a man whose trading posts dotted the trails from here to the mountains, whose freight wagons carried goods to settlements where no one else dared go. His was a name spoken in every saloon and general store, a man whose dealings shaped the fortunes of many. Camden told him how his wagon had broken down miles from town, how he'd tried to walk the rest of the way under the punishing sun, and how his strength had finally given out. "You picked me up when you didn't have to," Camden said. "That's not something I'll forget." Luke shrugged slightly. "Did what needed doing." Camden's smile deepened. "Sometimes that's the rarest thing of all." He paused, studying Luke with a shrewdness that seemed to see more than what was in front of him. "What do you do, Caldwell?" Luke told him about the small patch of land, the few animals, the odd jobs, the fire that had taken their barn. He didn't embellish or complain, just laid it out plain. Camden listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Luke finished, Camden nodded once, as if a decision had been made. "Come see me when I'm back on my feet," he said. "Bring your wife. I've got something I think might suit you both." The following week, Camden sent word that he was home and ready for visitors. Luke and Evelyn rode out to his estate on the edge of town, a sprawling property with a wide porch and shade trees that cast cool shadows over the lawn. Camden greeted them warmly, leading them to a table laid with cold tea and biscuits. "I've been thinking about you," Camden said, looking from Luke to Evelyn. "About what happened out there on the road. You didn't know who I was, but you stopped anyway. I've built a lot in my life, but I've also learned you can't build anything worth having without good people." He told them of a ranch he owned a day's ride north, a fine spread of land with good water, sturdy fences, and a herd ready for the right hands. He'd been looking for someone to take it over, someone he could trust. "I think you might be the man for it," Camden said to Luke, "and I reckon your wife has the grit for it too." Luke felt the weight of Evelyn's gaze on him, the surprise and hope that flickered in her eyes. Camden smiled, leaning back in his chair. "It's yours if you want it. Call it payment for a debt I can't put a price on." In that moment, the wind seemed to shift, carrying with it not the scent of loss and smoke, but the clean, sharp promise of something new. The weeks that followed their meeting with William Camden passed in a haze of work and quiet astonishment. Luke and Evelyn found themselves in possession of a ranch far beyond anything they had dared to imagine in those dark days after the fire. The land Camden had given them was rich with grass that swayed in the wind like an emerald sea, its pastures bordered by sturdy fences and fed by a spring that never seemed to run dry. The house, though simple in design, stood strong against the elements, with wide windows that let in the morning light and a porch deep enough to sit on during summer storms. The herd was sound and healthy, the horses well-bred and eager under saddle. For the first time in months, there was no constant fear of how they would make it through the next week. Instead, their days were filled with the steady rhythm of mending, tending, riding, and planning for a future that seemed not only possible but promising. Evelyn threw herself into learning every detail of the new place. She oversaw the storage of supplies in the barn, made lists of what was needed for the coming winter, and even began planting a vegetable garden behind the house. Luke worked alongside the hands Camden had sent to help them settle in, repairing sections of fencing, branding calves, and riding the far reaches of the property to familiarize himself with every hill and hollow. The wind here was different, brisk and clean, carrying the scent of grass instead of smoke. And with it came a feeling of renewal neither of them could deny. But news travels fast in a small town, and before long, word of Luke and Evelyn's change in fortune reached every porch and saloon in Red Bluff. Reactions were mixed. Some offered genuine congratulations, others a thin smile that did little to hide their surprise or their resentment. And somewhere among the murmurs and the raised eyebrows, the story reached the ears of Thomas Hargraves. The man who had once dismissed Luke as a poor drifter now sat in his study, hearing from acquaintances that the young cowboy not only had a ranch, but one that rivaled his own in size and quality. It was not long after this that fate intervened in a way neither family could have foreseen. Thomas had been away for several days, riding the far edges of his land to inspect a section of fence damaged by spring storms. On his way back, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled into evening, he began to feel a tightness in his chest. At first he dismissed it as the result of too many hours in the saddle, but the pressure grew sharper, stealing his breath and making his hands tremble on the reins. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the chill in the air, and the world seemed to narrow to the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. By the time he reached a fork in the trail, he knew he would not make it to his own house. His vision blurred and the strength in his legs faltered. The only dwelling within reach was the Caldwell Ranch, though he had never set foot on it. With no other choice, he turned his horse toward the dark outline of the house in the distance. Evelyn was on the porch when she saw the figure approaching, swaying in the saddle. She recognized the horse before she recognized the rider, and by the time Luke stepped out of the barn, she was already halfway across the yard. Thomas barely managed to dismount before his knees buckled. Luke caught him under the arms, feeling the tremor in his body and the shallow, rapid breaths that spoke of something more than exhaustion. They carried him inside, laying him on the settee in the front room. Evelyn's face was pale, her hands steady but quick as she fetched cool water and a blanket. Luke sent one of the ranch hands to fetch the doctor, but it happened that Camden, ever mindful of the importance of readiness, had ensured their new ranch was stocked with medical supplies and visited regularly by a physician in his employ. Within minutes, the doctor arrived from the bunkhouse where he had been tending to one of the ranch hands, his bag in hand. The diagnosis was swift, a mild heart attack caught in time. They eased Thomas into the guest room, propped on pillows, and began the slow work of ensuring his breathing steadied and the pain in his chest subsided. Evelyn stayed by his side through the night, her eyes moving from his face to the clock on the wall and back again, counting each steady rise and fall of his chest. Luke checked in quietly, bringing water or adjusting the lamp, but left them mostly alone, understanding that there were words between father and daughter that might need to wait for the right moment. Morning brought a pale light through the curtains and a touch more color to Thomas's cheeks. He opened his eyes to find Evelyn seated beside him, her hair pulled back, her dress wrinkled from having slept in the chair. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he cleared his throat, his voice rough. "This is your home?" She nodded. "Ours. Luke's and mine. Camden gave it to us. Thomas's gaze drifted to the doorway, where Luke stood watching, one hand resting on the frame. He held that gaze for a moment, then looked back at his daughter. "He saved me," Thomas said quietly. Evelyn's voice softened. "Just as he saved the man who gave us this place." The days that followed were a slow recovery. Thomas remained in the guest room, tended to by Evelyn and occasionally by Luke when Evelyn was busy elsewhere. The air between the men was careful at first, but there was no hostility in it now, only a tentative respect. Thomas asked questions about the land, about the cattle, about the arrangements with Camden, and Luke answered plainly, without pride or apology. By the end of the week, Thomas was strong enough to stand and take a short walk on the porch. He paused there, looking out over the pastures, the herd grazing peacefully in the distance, the barn standing solid against the sky. He turned to Luke, who had come to stand beside him. "I misjudged you," Thomas said simply. "I saw only what you didn't have, not what you are." Luke inclined his head, accepting the words without flourish. "We all see what we expect, until something changes it." That evening, Thomas called Evelyn and Luke into the front room. The lamplight cast a warm glow over the wood-paneled walls, and outside the crickets had begun their night song. Thomas spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He apologized not only for the harsh things he had said and done, but for the pride that had blinded him to what mattered. He told them he wished to set aside the past and give them his blessing, to see them married properly, with family gathered and the community present. Evelyn felt the tightness in her chest ease, a weight she had carried since the day she left her parents' home finally lifting. Luke met her eyes, and in that look was the acknowledgement of how far they had come. The wedding was set for late summer, when the days were long and the evenings warm. They chose to hold it on the ranch, beneath the open sky, with the rolling pastures as their backdrop. Neighbors came from miles around, some on horseback, others in wagons decorated with wildflowers. The smell of roasting beef drifted from the cook fires, mingling with the sweet scent of hay and the sharper tang of leather from the saddles lined up near the barn. A fiddler and a guitarist took their places near the porch, and soon music wove through the air, bright and lilting. Evelyn wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton, her hair braided with small white blooms she had picked that morning. Luke stood tall beside her in his best shirt, the brim of his hat shading his eyes until the moment they exchanged vows. Thomas stood near the front, his arm around Margaret's shoulders, his expression a blend of pride and humility. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the gathered crowd was as wide and warm as the land itself. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose, Luke and Evelyn stood on the porch, watching their guests dance in the yard. Lanterns swung from the beams overhead, casting circles of light on the ground, where boots scuffed in time to the music. Thomas approached them then, placing a hand on Luke's shoulder and meeting his gaze. "Welcome to the family, son," he said. Later, when the last of the guests had gone and the night was deep and quiet, Luke and Evelyn walked hand in hand to the edge of the porch. The stars spread out above them in a glittering expanse, the kind of sky that made a person believe in possibilities. They had weathered the whispers, the loss, the fire, and the long road to this place. And now, with the land beneath their feet and the future ahead, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The wind stirred the grass in the pasture, carrying the promise of the seasons to come. Evelyn leaned into Luke's side and he wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. Somewhere in the distance, a horse nickered softly, and the quiet of the plains settled around them like a benediction. Love had taken root here, deep and unshakable, and it would hold fast through whatever storms might come. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video for another unforgettable journey, and explore our other videos for more powerful stories. And please, share this one with someone who needs to hear it.